Friedman in Cut 3 warned about this kind of welcoming by tech companies of government regulators and benefactors.
Business in general has something of a suicidal instinct. It often proposes laws in its own self-interest, which destroy the underlying basis of the whole private enterprise system. I believe that is what has been happening recently in the computer industry. Silicon Valley is suicidal in calling government in to mediate in its disputes among some of the big companies in the area and Microsoft. The end result will be that an industry that up to now has been able to proceed at a marvelous pace with little or no government regulation. It has been a wonderful example of the efficiencies of a strictly free private market. That industry is now going to have government all over it. It's going to spend in legal fees over the next 10 or 20 years, money which society would benefit from much more if it were spent in the kind of research and development that has brought us the many miracles in the area of internet, in the area of home computers, industry computers, and all the rest.
That was 21 years ago. His words ring far truer today than they did even then. Let's talk a little bit more about the idea of regulating big tech and what it could mean, why they would like a seat at the table, and more with Matthew Feeney, who's director of the Project on Emerging Technologies at the Cato Institute, and he joins us now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Matthew, thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time today.
No, well, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So I want to get your reactions first to both the clip of Mark Zuckerberg saying, hey, if it's the right regulation, not only do we welcome it, but we'll help you write it, but also Milton Friedman in 1999 warning about big tech, like so many businesses often do, embracing government involvement in their affairs.
Right. I thought it was really interesting that you highlighted that clip because it really does showcase something that market liberals, libertarians have been saying for a while, which is that we should be wary of so-called regulatory capture, namely that there is a risk to regulations, and regulations can be weaponized by market incumbents. And in this case, Facebook's a good example, which is that it's not a surprise that companies in this kind of market position are hesitant to embrace regulations, but once they see the writing on the wall, then they'll oppose regulations up until the point that they can write them. And Facebook, Google, all the big names in Silicon Valley, they can hire more engineers and lawyers than God. And they will always be in an advantageous position when it comes to this kind of political environment, which is one where you have the right and the left coming together in an attempt to regulate an industry. And, looking at Milton Friedman, in that clip you showed just reveals how right he was, as he was about so much.
It's so interesting when you say right and left coming together, because while they may be united on the idea, increasingly so at least, that government should be more heavily involved in regulating big tech, the reasons behind it and what they would like to see done are different. For example, on the right, you have pushback saying, oh, President Trump should not be fact-checked by Twitter, and the government should require that they don't fact-check the President of the United States on a comment that he makes on Twitter. But then on the other hand, you have Democrats who will say, wait a second, we should require that Facebook and Twitter police content more actively to make sure that misinformation, however that's defined, is not presented. At least that's how I read the argument. So while they may be increasingly unified on the idea of let's regulate, the reasons for it and the ways they want to go about it seem to be different, Matthew.
That's right. I would also say that from usually the political left, but sometimes on the political right, you also have claims of monopoly. And I know that you and Professor Volokh had a brief discussion about Section 230 and monopoly, so I don't want to retread material that your viewers have already seen, but I'll just mention that the political environment where you have complaints about a certain industry that are so different make a big piece of legislation hard to imagine. I don't know how they can square these holes. A piece of legislation that addresses the concerns of the Ted Cruzes and the Josh Hawleys on one hand, but then also the Elizabeth Warrens on the other, is hard to envision at this point. But unfortunately, we're in an election year, so actually it's advantageous for politicians of all stripes to look as if they're doing something about these problems associated with big tech. But my position is that these companies aren't monopolies, that they should be free to moderate their content as much as they want. And that's in large part because I want there to be a market where those who have a better idea than Facebook, those who have a better idea than YouTube and Twitter can actually build one. And I worry about the impacts of regulations that actually make competition harder.
Something that's fascinating to me, too, and then we'll dive into some more specifics of this discussion with you, Matthew Feeney, our guest from the Cato Institute, is that, look, both sides, so to speak, are talking about increasing regulation of Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, so on and so forth. But if you can't agree on the basis for the regulation and you can't agree on what you should regulate, maybe that's a sign that you shouldn't get into the business of regulating it in the first place, in part because you're going to find a mess of different interests at play, different trajectories, different motives, different policies put in place that could be increasingly contradictory. I don't understand how anybody thinks that if you got two sides of the aisle that are arguing for different forms of regulation, and actually you still have a lot of people on the right, like myself, I consider myself a conservative, who are more libertarian on this and are not on board with the idea of increased regulation. If you've got so much division, the idea that the president of the United States, as we'll get into, should unilaterally take steps like what he introduced yesterday in his executive order, I think should be deeply concerning to people, because you can't even agree on where to go, much less what you should be doing and why.
Well, right. As a libertarian myself, I actually get worried by bipartisanship sometimes. Too much agreement on these kind of issues is sometimes concerning. I know that you and Professor Volokh had a discussion about 230. I would just mention that when the Senate considered the last amendment to 230, which dealt with content associated with human trafficking, there were only 2 votes against it. John McCain didn't make it because he was too ill, but the only 2 votes in the Senate against it were Senator Wyden, a Democrat, who actually co-authored Section 230 when he was a member of the House, and Rand Paul, who may have been flexing some of his libertarian instincts. And I think that's a hint at that actually, if you can hook an amendment or a regulation to a law, in order to get bipartisan support, you just have to link it to something horrible like human trafficking. And at the moment, you have conversations about legislation called the Earn It Act, which is linked to images of child sexual abuse and exploitation, which of course is content no one wants to be associated with or to be portrayed as defending in any way, even though defenders of 230, of course, are not in that boat. But it's very difficult politically, oftentimes, to make a stand when that's the kind of conversation that's surrounding the issue.
Yeah, the nuance is lost all too often in politics, to be sure. I want to read a passage to you, Matthew Feeney, again, director of the Cato Institute's project on emerging technologies, from a New York Post op-ed this week by Sohrab Amari, who is the Post op-ed editor. And he said this, quote, "Here's the deal. If I publish libelous claims in the Post, my victims can hold the Post liable in court. But Twitter is immune to such suits under the 1996 Communications Decency Act. Section 230 of the law, which you have been referencing, which we talked with Professor Eugene Volokh about in the last segment, provides that, quote, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as a publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. But note," the author of this piece goes on, "the underlying assumption that online bulletin boards, and that's what Twitter is, a glorified bulletin board, don't act as publishers. But by policing conservatives and fact-checking, in quotes, the Republican president of the United States, Twitter is acting exactly like a publisher. So why should one class of publishers, such as the Post, be held liable, while another gets to escape liability merely because its editors are hard-left California geeks?" Now, obviously, I don't want you to so much address the legal standpoint on that, but the idea from a government policy standpoint, what do you make of his argument? We hear it from conservatives a lot, that this is what should be done as far as the treatment, or changed in terms of the mindset of treatment of social media companies, not just as platforms, but as publishers.
Right. When I hear criticism like this, I think it reveals an ignorance of where the current legal framework came from in the first place. Just imagine this thought experiment. Imagine that Twitter was the publisher of content uploaded by third parties, or the vast majority of it. There are hundreds of millions of tweets posted every single day. If Twitter was held legally liable for any tweet that was put up, you would see the end of Twitter. You would certainly see the end of President Trump's Twitter account, and you would certainly see the end of Twitter as we know it. The reason that we don't treat Twitter as a publisher in the way that people think of the New York Times as a publisher is because these are different kind of entities, and that's what Representatives Chris Cox and Ron Wyden actually understood in 1996 when they were drafting Section 230. I want to stress, though, something important here which gets lost in this debate is you'll often hear people saying there's a distinction here between publishers and platforms. And this is a made-up distinction that isn't in the law at all. In fact, publishers, as we traditionally understand them, are covered by Section 230. So, for example, the op-ed you just quoted, if there's libelous content in there, then the author and the publisher can certainly be sued. But if there's libelous content in the comment section, then that comment section is an interactive computer service under Section 230. So I think this distinction really actually muddles the water and makes the debate much more difficult. And I think that people who are angry about the way that Twitter and Facebook are moderating content should really appreciate that Section 230 didn't come out of thin air. And in fact, it was lawmakers who took a look at the field and understood that if the internet was treated in the way that the author of the op-ed suggests, there would be far less speech online, because you are in a situation now where you have hundreds of millions of tweets per day. You have something like 400 hours of content uploaded to YouTube every minute. There's no conceivable way that it would be responsible for a company in a world where they could be held liable for that just to let people upload it. So look, if you want to destroy the internet as we know it, if you want to get rid of social media and the exchange of ideas that we've come used to, then I feel like people should just say that. But the idea that Twitter would look anything like Twitter if it was treated like the publisher of the tweets that people tweet is silly.
What about, though, being consistent in application of the rules? Because it does seem like more often than not, it's conservatives that are the ones, at least from a political standpoint, that are being fact-checked or that find their accounts suspended or particular tweets removed and what have you. And so there's that argument, for example, from PragerU that you need to be more fair in your application. In that case, of course, that's on YouTube and blocking of certain content or making it more difficult to access particular content. But the idea is that you're not being consistent, you're not treating conservatives fairly, and therefore the government should potentially get involved in ensuring that there is fair application of the rules and that conservatives are not being unduly censored.
Right. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I'll start at the beginning, which is that even if the Silicon Valley companies were in some kind of concerted, organized campaign to take down conservative content, then they should be free to do so. These are private companies. They should be free to do that. Is there evidence they're doing this? Well, one, I would just return to what I said earlier, which is there's so much information being shared every hour, every minute on these platforms that you will, of course, be able to find inconsistencies with the content moderation rules. And that's not a surprise. But conservatives who are concerned about this should appreciate that people on the political left have also made their own complaints. The World Socialist website wrote a letter to Google complaining about Google's censorship of left-wing views and that Google was trying to make sure that people couldn't learn about socialism. You had complaints from activists about Black Lives Matter content. And if you think about it, the case like PragerU, Prager's concern was that something like 12% of his videos on YouTube were being put in restricted mode, and that this was evidence of some kind of anti-conservative bias, totally ignoring the fact that actually YouTube channels that are run by people like the Young Turks or The Daily Show have a far higher percentage of their videos put in this restricted mode, which I hardly think is evidence of anti-conservative bias. So I'll mention that I've written about claims of anti-conservative bias before on the Cato blog, on Medium, at a paper for George Mason University. I don't find the arguments convincing, but I'll just end with my libertarian point, which is even if it were true, even if Mark Zuckerberg woke up and said, you know what, anyone who's ever liked a Republican politician on Facebook, just delete their account, he should be free to do that. Your comment on who should be in the business of determining neutrality, I'd much rather private failure than public failure. I'd much rather Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook be bad at this than the FTC or the FCC be bad at it.
That's where I completely agree. Like, I think that there's enough to say that conservatives do face the brunt of, at least a little bit more of this sort of, shall we say, discrimination. But even if that's the case, your second argument about having government get involved as a result of that is not justified, is not supported, particularly because government is force. Government has the power of force, and once you get government involved, then it can manipulate things, it can provide direction, it can do all sorts of things that Facebook and Twitter as private companies can't do, because even though being in media, for example, as I am, it's kind of necessary to get involved in these platforms, it's not something that you are required to do. You don't have somebody at the point of a gun saying you must take this step, you must join Facebook or Twitter or else. However, if the federal government gets involved in certain ways, they do have the power of force to direct things in a way that Facebook and Twitter cannot. And that's dangerous.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And what this actually takes us, I think, nicely back to the question you asked at the beginning and the video clip of Mark Zuckerberg here, which is that these kind of regulations will help the companies that are in a position to engage in this kind of moderation. And we shouldn't ignore the fact that content moderation sounds easy to begin with, but it actually is very hard. So let's say that, look, Jimmy, you and I, we quit our jobs and we want to build a competitor to Facebook, say, and we've got some very friendly, very wealthy friends who are going to fund it. We might sit down and think, well, let's have a content moderation policy and let's write it. And we meet in a room and we say, look, should we have a policy that bans images of nude children? And you and I might say, like, yes, obviously, this is a good rule. But then, as Facebook experienced, someone uploads the footage, the photo, of the aftermath of that napalm bombing in the Vietnam War, which includes an image of a naked young girl running towards the photographer. It's one of the most iconic images of the 20th century, and Facebook initially took it down because it violated the rule. But then they put it back up, and there's a question of, well, do we have a historical significance exception? There was a tweet that targeted Meghan McCain, the daughter of John McCain, at her father's funeral with a photoshopped gun, and there were debates about, is this a threat under the rules of Twitter? And the point is that we shouldn't pretend that these decisions are easy. In fact, there are ways in which the same content can be viewed as good or bad. Facebook, I think it was, had a policy whereby if you showed footage of someone being bullied at school and you were condemning the bullying, then you could keep the footage up. But if it was laughing about the bullying victim, then you took it down. This is very difficult. It's complicated. And we shouldn't expect perfection. We should expect that there will be failures sometimes. But as I said earlier, I'd rather Facebook fail than the FTC.
Two final questions for you, Matthew Feeney, again, our guest from the Cato Institute. The first one, I want to play cut 9. This is President Trump yesterday laying out one of the steps that his executive order is taking in terms of Section 230 and in terms of some of the regulatory powers he'd like to restructure.
Therefore, today I'm signing an executive order to protect and uphold the free speech and rights of the American people. Currently, social media giants like Twitter receive an unprecedented liability shield based on the theory that they're a neutral platform, which they are not an editor with a viewpoint. My executive order calls for new regulations under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to make it that social media companies that engage in censoring or any political conduct will not be able to keep their liability shield. That's a big deal. They have a shield. They can do what they want. They have a shield. They're not going to have that shield.
Removing the, as he puts it, liability shield. Real briefly, Matthew Feeney, what do you make of the specifics of the executive order that the president issued yesterday?
Given his comment there, it sounds like Donald Trump is advocating for the removal of his own Twitter feed. The fact is that if you remove this liability shield, you're going to have far less content. I would also say that President Trump is just factually incorrect when he says that this liability shield is contingent on some kind of neutrality. He's not the only one to spread this myth. Senator Cruz, in questions to Mark Zuckerberg, also expressed this, but I hope that viewers consider that this actually isn't true. In fact, Section 230 encourages content moderation and protects firms like Twitter from removing content that they consider to be offensive or lewd or bad for their business model, even if that is language or content that is protected by the First Amendment. There's a ton of content out there that is legal, but you might not want for your service. Pornography, images of people being beheaded, photos of animals being tortured to death. This is all protected by the First Amendment, but it's not all business friendly. It's not all the kind of content people building social media sites would like to see. And what I hope people appreciate is that conservatives, especially when they talk about this kind of move that the president made yesterday, are actually digging their own graves without realizing it. Social media, as we know it, has, I would argue, been a massive benefit to American conservatives. It's never been easier for people in the world, let alone just conservatives, to find each other and to organize. And absent Section 230, the internet's plunged into a world where social media as we know it does not exist. And I think that's not just bad for conservatives, but anyone with a viewpoint to share.
I'm coming up on a decade of conservative talk radio and recently started this web show in partnership with the Washington Examiner. There used to be something called the Fairness Doctrine, and that was the government making sure that there was an equal time requirement in place for content that was provided in the radio. When that was removed, that allowed for conservative talk radio to take off, and the internet really has provided tremendously more opportunities for conservatives, to your point, Matthew Feeney, to get the message out even more than ever before, get around the mainstream media, so on and so forth. And I do think that is an important perspective to keep in mind. Now, final question for you. There is this idea, whether we're talking about Facebook, Twitter, YouTube's parent company, Google, whatever, when it comes to online search engines and social media platforms and other aspects, even Amazon and what have you. There's discussion about treating these types of big tech companies as public utilities. What would that entail, and what do you make of that argument?
I'm against it, but I also think that depending on who you ask, this means something different. It would certainly mean that there would be far more of the kind of content that's objectionable out there. I think people oftentimes like to talk about telephone companies and these kind of analogies. Yes. But the point is, when I call you on the phone, the only parties to those calls are you and me. Right, but the whole point of social media is that you're actually trying to get the message out to many, many other people, and actually. People are often on Facebook and Twitter because they want people they've never met or never seen to hear their message. And the problem is, if you treat it like a public utility, you're running into all kinds of different issues about the kind of speech that will or will not be allowed. And you run the risk, I think, of more people interacting with content they don't want because companies will be under much different kind of pressures. So it's similar to the arguments that I was discussing earlier, which is if you want more horrific but legal content out there, I don't see how you could limit that in a way that's family friendly, for example, while also trying to maintain that these are some kind of public utilities. I also just think that they're just clearly not. I don't know why this argument seems to never die, but the internet is much more than Silicon Valley, and there are, believe it or not, there are other places that people can go to spread their message. I understand why some people might be frustrated that they're not allowed into the most popular house party in town, but that doesn't entitle you to call the cops and demand that you be let in. The answer to this, I think, is for a market where people who want to build the kind of content moderation policies they can are free to. And my worry is that more regulation just makes market incumbents much, much stronger and harder to dethrone.
No, I think the government should allow me into that party, Matthew. I mean, the idea that I was excluded is just not fair. Good points today, Matthew Feeney of the Cato Institute and the director of the Project on Emerging Technologies. Really appreciate you joining us on this Free to Choose Friday edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Once again, Matthew Feeney joining us from the Cato Institute. Thanks for watching this clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. You do not want to miss a minute of engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel, and you'll be sure to catch our live broadcast. I appreciate your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.